Okay, so we're about to go live. So there is a, you can go back to the first slide, please. So we're on live on YouTube. So there is a YouTube channel for Suzanne here. You can look for computing research methods, and some of the presentations are there. All right, so today we're looking at research design. This is the week 4 of the class. Next slide, please. So as we said in previous weeks, when you're doing a research project, you want to select it carefully. Generally speaking, the research study or the research problem you select should be of interest. You should have some knowledge about that area. It should be significant, meaning that if you do the study, there is a likelihood it could have benefit to somebody, and those somebodies would typically be scholars, policymakers, and others. And the others, it really varies from project to project. And it should be feasible, as in terms of you can do it, and it should be something that is manageable in a particular time frame. Next slide. So as we said previous weeks, research studies that you are selecting come from possibly theory, from scholarly articles, either individual empirical research studies, systematic reviews, meta-analytical studies, your actual experience or what is happening around you in the context. Hold on. Can anybody tell me, because I can certainly tell you, what is the difference between a single study, a systematic review, and a meta-analytical study? Because we've gone over this briefly. Anybody can make an attempt? We have 42 people here, more or less. So just let me help you out here. It's not an answer to the question. Remember, we're not using the word research here to just do an investigation to find out something that's been done before. That's the everyday way in which the word research is used. So we're talking all of these three types of research studies listed here on the existing literature. All of them are to answer one or more research questions that will fill what is called a gap in the literature, meaning that that is something that is not known by experts and is not published. Or if it is published, there is controversy. So in all of these three types of research studies, and there are other types, you would have one or more research questions, and the study is conducted to answer those research questions. But I want to know what's the difference between the three of them. So I'm just filling up time while people are getting their courage up or finding their notes to tell us the difference. Go. We have 42 people and not one person can make an attempt. Even what a single research study is. That is not a good sign, guys. Okay, one person says systematic reviews tend to be more accurate than the single research. Okay, so just to be really precise, single research is not really technically good English. So I would agree with the gist of what this person is saying. A systematic review is more accurate than one single empirical study, but accurate about what? So yeah, you're along the right line. And anybody explain why that's the gist of that is correct? Well, let's help it out by saying what's a systematic review. A systematic review is essentially a comprehensive study of a particular research question, or well, let's go with number one research question, where it's looking at peer-reviewed scholarly literature that meets some inclusion and exclusion criteria for a particular, usually range of time. And so it gives a comprehensive answer to the research study. So the reason why this person in privacy is telling me it's more accurate. What happens is one single study doesn't prove anything. When you have a lot of studies on the same thing, you can then come up with a generalization. So one study will suggest and a combination of multiple suggestions, then you can now say that there is either little or moderate or strong evidence that X, Y, and Z is the case. So that's right. So that was one person's answer in the text. And can anybody tell me what is a meta-analytical study? You don't have to talk all at once. Anyway, I see nobody answering, so let me just make a stab at it out of my head. Meta-analytical study is a type of systematic review. It's one where the researcher or research team essentially does a study to answer a research question by taking the data from many studies in order to employ some type of statistical analysis to answer the research questions. Yeah, I believe it's here for the moment, but we have lots of other things to talk about today. Next slide. Long and short, when you're taking a study, you're going to bring some what your experience, also what you're really sharp at. So when you're selecting a study, you want to generally delimit you're writing up people go big and they go small. So usually go about something good, narrate through. Narrating is and you have to keep manageable and some idea that it's a problem in research. Yes, I see that I'm still having internet access problems. I guess maybe I should change location. Anyway, sorry about that. The problem statement, as we have done, this is a review we've done in the past. So the first assignment, as you must recall by now, is a concept paper. And the second thing in the concept, not the second thing, you're right, is the problem statement. The first part is the background, which is not necessarily written first. There's a background and then there's a problem statement. And the problem statement is a summary of what's in the background in 2 or 3 sentences. And it basically tells the reader what you're researching in a concise manner. And so you want to say it in as few words as possible. And obviously every project in this class has computing component. And the thing that a lot of students tend to overlook, because it's called a problem statement, they normally don't miss writing about a problem. But usually anywhere from a quarter to a half of the students, even when I tell them in my tutorial, forget that they need to write the way in which computers are utilized to solve that problem or could be utilized in the problem statement, right? So you need to have at least one sentence about the problem and at least one sentence about how computers either are used or could be used to fix that problem. Good? So if a problem statement is well written, it identifies all the variables of interest that are important, usually 1, 2, or 3. Actually, there could be more variables, but the most important ones are in the problem statement. And if it is that you want to find out if there is a link, you say what is, like a problem statement may say it is unclear whether, I don't know, whether sleep is associated with obesity, which by the way, there is. Or it's unclear whether fear of COVID is associated with death by COVID. How about that? I have no idea if those two things are associated, right? And I don't know even know where I'm going with this. I just wanted to bring up something that we don't know what the relationship is. But the point is, in a problem statement, you can talk about the relationship. So for example, we could postulate that there much of society believes that university education is associated with an increased remuneration. Not sure, okay? By the way, there's actually a lot of evidence now that that's not always the case, even though it continues to be the case across the globe overall. So anyway, but in a good problem sum, you're going to identify the variables, and if you want to look at relationships, as in links or association between those variables, and if there are people in your study, what do I mean by people? If you're going to measure things by collecting it about people, the types of the participants, it doesn't have to be one type, it could be more than one type. So if you're looking at how much does IS systems impact organizations, you may want to look at the business managers and the end users and the technical personnel, whatever. Whoever is going to be involved, all of those should be in the problem statement. Next slide. So the research questions is essentially formulated to tell you what answers you want to collect by the data. And remember, the evidence is either qualitative, which means words, or quantitative, which means numbers, or both, which is a mixed method approach that will address your problem that you state in the problem statement. Next slide. So here's an example, COVID-19 health literacy. And here's a problem statement, the purpose. In fact, even though I have this here as the problem statement, this could actually be the purpose statement, not the problem statement, because once you say the purpose or the aim of the study, that's really a problem. That's really a purpose statement. But this says the purpose of the study is to investigate the relationship between the perceptions about online misinformation, about COVID-19 and compliance with government protocols among the university community during the pandemic. So, you know, that's actually a purpose statement. So for example, here's how it could be framed as a problem statement. Here's 2 sentences. I'm just going to do it on the fly. Online misinformation. What do I want to say about this? Right. Online misinformation is prevalent on social media and other online platforms since the pandemic. And then I can have whole references, citations. That's my first. So that's my problem. And then the second thing could be there's been a plethora of approaches to reduce the misinformation using artificial intelligence by social media companies and health organizations. Then maybe I could make another sentence. It is unclear if these efforts have been effective. Maybe something like that. So I've actually said what the problem is, which my problem is that there's an online misinformation about COVID. And then I made some statement about computing, which is that there are, you know, both AI and health promotion efforts. I don't know, sorry, because online health promotion is it's actually a computing related element. And then I say, but we don't know, according to me, we don't know if there's a relationship between the two. So there's the question. Is there a relationship between the perceptions of online misinformation about COVID-19 and compliance with government protocols in Jamaica universities? Next slide. So what are the variables? Go back up to the thing before, and who are the participants? Anybody? What are the participants here? And what are the variables? Let's be basic with the variables. That's an easier question. Sorry, the variables here is what are we going to measure? We still have over 45 people. Over 40 people for sure. Don't speak at once. What are the variables, guys? Or somebody in the chat, let's see what the chat says. Perception of what? Online misinformation. People still doing things correctly. Perception of COVID-19. What is not perception of COVID-19? So it's actually perception of online misinformation. What was the in the chat? This thing where I'm going to look at the screen, online misinformation. The thing about is how we're going to measure online misinformation. So let me just talk about is perception of online misinformation. Now the thing about it, there are two ways you could measure potentially perception of online misinformation. You could interview people or put them in a focus group. For those who don't know, a focus group is where you have a lot of people together, usually like not a lot, like a group of people from 5 to 12 typically, and then you ask them interview questions in a group. So in this particular project, we could do an interview and ask people how they think and feel about the misinformation about COVID-19, because we all know there's a lot of fake news. But we could also give a questionnaire, not true? So can anybody tell me if a questionnaire is quantitative or qualitative? As in a questionnaire about perception about online misinformation. What was the answer?
Quantitative.
Yeah, it's quantitative. So actually perceptions about online misinformation could be qualitative or quantitative. But if you do it by a questionnaire, it's definitely, sorry, and for those who don't get it, let me not answer my own question. Give me one example item on the questionnaire that would be quantitative. Anybody? Please answer. Not all at once. Well, we're taking long, so let me give you one. Age? No, age is a demographic we're talking about. So that's a potential variable. So there could be a second research question. Hold on. How many persons have been affected in your family? That's not a question about the perception about online misinformation. And there was no question here about how much
the perception of online information.
No. Let me give you an example.
Miss, you can hear me?
I can hear you.
Would it be how much trust do you put in online information?
Right. That would and what would make it quantitative now? So that's a good question. Now give me the.
You had a scale.
Yeah, and just help the class out because we don't know what you mean by a scale.
Like you'd have a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 meaning most stressful, and then 1 means least stressful.
Sure. Right. So there are many ways you could do it. So like you could do it as a like our scores to say, I trust online information about COVID, and then strongly agree, disagree, all those options. Or we have another question there. Somebody had something. How often do you come across, this is a separate question, Thorn, good question. How often do you come across unworthy information online? And then it could be, you know, very often, neutral, you know, not often and rarely, or not at all, something like that. So everybody see how that's quantitative, because basically all of those are different options, and persons have to choose one of the options, and they're in order. And by the way, when you put it on a questionnaire, you always put it in the order that makes sense. Quantitative. You get to me? And if people answer that just in an open-ended way, that's qualitative. So if we wanted to do this and do a statistical analysis, we would need it to be quantitative. Because right now, you see how the question form is there a relationship between perceptions about online misinformation and compliance? So what is the other variable that's on the screen right now?
Compliance with government protocols.
Definitely among universities, in Jamaican universities, right? And again, we could do a open-ended question, or we could do it online. And since I'm suggesting that we do this using a statistical, we would do the same kind of whether online or printed questionnaire. And so we obviously want to know compliance with each of the government protocols. So there'll be compliance with hygiene, and compliance with physical distancing, and mask wearing, and curfew, and lockdown, not true? And whatever else, which I'm not forgetting, but I think those are most of the primary ones. Yes? You could even ask, if you wanted to be really detailed, you could even ask if people, but that's not really part of compliance. You could even ask if people promote compliance to other people. But anyway, next slide. So we looked at the variables, and who are the participants? You don't need to go back. Where is this being done?
Online. So persons online.
No.
University
Where's the
students.
setting? Where is the setting? It didn't have to be online. I actually said it was online or face-to-face, but if it was COVID, we would obviously be doing it online, but I said where? What is the setting of the study? The location?
Jamaica.
Yeah, man, go back and look, go back to the state, since you guys go back.
University.
Yeah, man, university. So who are the participants? Obviously.
University students.
Right, so either university students or university students and so whatever. It's university people, not true? Good, next slide. Right, university community is we didn't say there, so it's either all of the university community or the university staff, students, and administrative staff. In fact, there's also ancillary staff and technical staff. So the point is it could be staff and students. So once you have figured out at least tentatively your problem statement and tentatively your research question, then I would talk about that for the last 2 weeks, and hopefully also in your tutorial, you need to find relevant scholarly literature. And I had a office consultation where online, where somebody wanted some very precise, this is exactly how you do it. And I've been thinking ever since, if I can figure out if I can give it a step-by-step, but it's really tricky because at any rate, it's an iterative process. But you must find relevant scholarly literature, and that is in places called journal of, right? So you want to look for good journal articles, and then once you find your topic, one of the important parts is a research design. Because remember that list we had before? Your project must be feasible and manageable. So it's normally suggested, especially at the undergraduate level, that you find a research method, which would include the design and the audience, not the audience, the participants, and the selection. Well, okay, not every study in the world has people in it, but if it has people, you must determine what is the population and what is the sample, and you also must determine the approach you have for that sampling technique. But research design is not a simple thing for undergraduate students. So you can actually, it's not cheating to find a similar research study and say, oh, I'm going to just follow that research design. And then you can just write about it in your own words. Anyway, next slide. So to get the background, you're going to search using Google Scholar and other online databases at UTech. We have a long list, including IEEE, ACM, EBSCO host, and others. And so I got an email recently saying that the students couldn't find things on Google Scholar. And I reminded the students by email that articles can be found on the online database if you're a registered UTech student. But outside of that, you can also email the research librarians. The one for our faculty is Tracia Price, and there's also a chief research person. And since you're all doing the research in groups, at least 2 or 3 of you must be registered by now. So guys, it means that you can use the online databases on the UTech website, and you can also send an email to the people who their entire job is to help people find research articles. So I don't want to hear people saying they can't find the articles. Anyway, so in the process of finding articles, and your tutors, including me, can help you to know the process, but the end of it is hard work. And if you're not understanding how to do the hard work, the librarians are the reference people to help you with the process, but to know how to do it, as well as to help you actually find important articles to you. But when you're looking for papers, you want to look for 3 types of papers at a minimum: recent studies, preferably in the last 5 years. If it's a typical kind of study, there's some things that recent studies might be older than that. You also want to look for seminal, landmark studies. They all mean the same thing: pivotal, as in studies with a lot of citations that are very important in the field. And remember earlier I talked about systematic and meta-analytical studies. Those tend to give a good overview of the area. So if you can find recent systematic reviews, but even systematic reviews even 7 years old, that tends to give you a nice overview of the topic. It really depends on the topic as to how old it can be before it still be quite up to date. But systematic reviews and meta-analytical studies, so I suggest to everybody that before you go very far, you type in systematic review and your topic area and press enter in Google Scholar to see if there are any systematic reviews, because that will give you not only an overview in the paper, it will also give you a long list of references at the end of the document that you can use. Next slide. So this is, I guess, saying what I said before. Landmark studies are ones that have a big influence on the discipline, and essentially there is a process to learning how to find landmark studies, but Miles' rule of thumb is compared to other papers, those are the ones that have the most citations. What I love about Google Scholar, it actually tells you how many scholars have cited the paper. So the ones that have a higher level of citation, and that varies from field to field and from topic to topic, the ones that have the highest levels of citations are the landmark studies. Next slide. So you want to look at reviews. If there are any meta-analytical reviews, you always want to look at those, because those are more precise, because they use statistical analysis. However, systematic reviews do not use statistics. They essentially read. They use this thing called inclusion and inclusion criteria to decide which papers should be included. And then they read through all the papers that meet the inclusion criteria, to come up with a comprehensive overview of what's happening in those papers. Systematic reviews are better than what are called narrative reviews because they will essentially look critically appraise all the articles in a field in a literal structured fashion. Next slide. So the systematic review states objectives with predefined eligibility criteria. It has a clear methodology which anybody can reproduce who wants to do a similar systematic review. It actually indicates the keyword that is used to identify all the studies. Then it determines if the studies are like excellent, moderate, or high quality. So it looks at the validity of those studies to see whether they should be looking for basically risk of bias. And by the way, there are many kinds of bias in research studies. And then the presentation is logically structured. And so you can find what has been the results of these various studies that meet the inclusion criteria. And if it's not a rapid review, it takes quite a little while. That's interesting because, yeah, leave it alone. It can take less than that, but if somebody knows what it's doing. But the system of reviews that include 2 or more people tend to take at least 6 months. Next slide. So you should know that the methods are an important part because since you know by now, if you're here for the first time, that the goal of a research project is to answer the research question. Even though the research question is the heart of the project, if you don't have a research design that matches the research question, then your answer to the research question is going to be problematic at best and basically utter nonsense at worst. So the research, the validity and reliability of the approach is very important. So methods include the research design, we're going to talk about it in a second, the setting, population, sample, if it's people. So the setting is where it is. So for example, at an educational institution, it could be we're at a high school and the population is both high school teachers and high school students. In fact, we could just say first form and second form would be the students, and the sample would be like maybe we're selecting 5 people in each class and 1 teacher from each of the year groups or whatever. Maybe 3 first form teachers and 3 second form. I don't know, I'm just making something as I go along. And then you need to determine what are the data collection instruments that match your research question. So we could decide here that we're going to administer focus groups to the teachers, get them together in a group and ask them some questions, which might decide to give the students online surveys and ask the administrators interviews face-to-face or perhaps even online. Next slide. So there are different types of research designs. And in this class, we're actually not going to look at all of them. I would say we want to focus on descriptive research, experimental research, correlation research, and causal comparative research. And before we go on, many people just say that research designs can simply be divided into the first 2, but that's actually a little bit of a simplification. But let's move on to the next slide. So with surveys, there are various types. You can do a census survey. So like, you know, when the government of Jamaica does a census typically every 10 years because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The census has been actually delayed by a year, but they do a census with an attempt to collect data from every person in the population. Actually, that's not what happens because some people are not willing, but they're certainly making a strong attempt. Most research are sample surveys where the intention is to collect data from a subset of the population, right? So, and when we say I'm so tired. When we say the population in a in the census for done by government is for the entire population of children and adults. But typically in survey studies, the population is a special group, you know, so you could do a survey on special need athletes, or you could do a survey on programmers at fiscal services. And then the sample would be a subset of the population. You could decide that you're going to, I said, programmers at fiscal services. That's a government agency that produces software development software for the government agencies and ministries. We could decide that we're going to do an online survey of 30% of the programmers at fiscal services, for example, and that would be a sample of the population of programmers at fiscal services. Next slide. It's very common in research to invite people to do self-report, and there's some challenge with that because it could be that they have poor recall or that they don't want to tell the whole truth. So there can be some challenges there. Next slide. So we can divide surveys into cross-sectional and longitudinal. A cross-sectional survey is one that is the idea that is done all at once. But that single period is not literally in an instant, it's not in a flash. It's usually in a few weeks. But I have the example of the Jamaica Lifestyle Survey that was a cross-sectional study that took more than a year to collect the data. So the way I like to describe a cross-sectional survey is one where for each participant in the study, data is collected. Each type of data is only collected once. So I was actually in the lifestyle survey because they knocked at my door. I was chosen by chance. Well, it was my role was chosen by chance, and then I think it was my side of the row was chosen also by chance, some sort like that. But they took my blood pressure, my weight, my some blood tests, asked a long list of items on a questionnaire that took more than an hour and a half, took very long. And they actually gave me a pedometer that was unmarked, that didn't happen at the same time. And even in my case, the reason I'm saying is cross-sectional because nothing was measured more than once. Even when they attempted to measure my physical activity for a week, it was measured at once. They gave me a pedometer and they came back for it just short of a week later, but about an hour early. In fact, they was calling me because I found out later that those machines are very expensive. They're calling me to make sure I'm giving back the machine because basically they needed a accurate measurement of how much physical activity because they were trying to figure out how active, a lot of things about the health and lifestyle of Jamaica. That's why it's called a lifestyle survey. So the snapshot doesn't mean that it's all at once. It basically means that we're trying to make an attempt to see what a whole bunch of people are like at a particular time, you know? And it can be used for attitudes, it can be used for knowledge, it can be used, I just told you, for health behavior, many different things. Next slide. So to carry out a cross-sectional study, you're going to have variables, like we just talked about some variables before, and all of those variables, you need to know how they're defined and then have a specific way how to measure them. It's always better, where possible, to use an instrument, and by that we don't mean the scale you have at home. Even questionnaires are instruments. So it's always better to use a pre-existing instrument that already has the validity and reliability measured than to make up your own if possible. It's always better to adapt the questionnaire that pre-exists than to create one from scratch. So then you need to, after you figure out the instrument that you will use, then you want to figure out your sampling approach. And we're going to talk about in the future things like probability and non-probability sampling. We don't have time for that today. Obviously, after you figure that out, you're going to literally use the instrument like an interview set of questions or the questionnaire or observations or whatever it is. And then you're going to analyze the data and come up with some conclusions to the questions or question. Next slide. In a longitudinal survey, you're going to take data from 2 or more times from the same thing on the study, which could be a person, it doesn't have to be a person. So you can have either trend surveys, cohort surveys, or panel surveys. And let's just talk briefly about the first two. A trend survey is when you look to see, let's take like the population and see if there's a change over time. So we would, for example, we could decide skit students. We want to look at skit students in first year to see if their academic performance and their first year experience is similar over time. A cohort would be taking the same, maybe the skip first year students this year and looking at them for the next 20 years to see how they succeed in their career or whatever you wanted to measure. Next slide. So in a survey research, you're going to define the problem because in every study you have to define the problem. You figure out who are the target population because surveys are done of people. You're going to choose whatever instrument or modify the instrument, decide how you're going to collect the data, and figure out if you're going to do it by self-report or otherwise, and then compile it and analyze the data. Next slide. So the other major type of research that we're going to talk about for the next few seconds of the class is experimental research. Now let's consider the gold standard of research. So if you do experimental research and it's executed properly and well designed, then you're going to be able to say that the research suggests X, Y, and Z if the statistical analysis shows that there is a alpha value that is matching what you have set out to match, like alpha less than or equal to 0.01, which we'll talk about in a bit. So in a research study, you're looking at least 2 variables to see if one variable called the independent variable impacts the dependent variable. There are lots of other variables. So like somebody before was saying age. So remember, we're looking at the COVID literacy, wanted to know whether perception of perception of fake news about COVID had any effect on people's compliance with COVID protocols. So there are a whole lot of extraneous variables that might have an impact, like age, like education, like health literacy, like a long list. And this is important because let's take health literacy. The more educated about health somebody is, the more likely they're not to be duped by fake news. So some extraneous variables need to be measured because if they're not measured, you may think that there's actually a relationship between the 2 variables when there actually is what's called a confounding variable, as in a type. Okay, some extraneous variables are confounding or some are not. The ones that are confounding actually has an impact on the dependent variable. Next slide. So the goal of the experimental research is to see if there's a hypothesis that can be tested that will prove to be true, so to speak. So in experimental research, you're manipulating at least one variable and you're trying to figure out if that affects another variable. And the idea is to use equivalent groups. Typically that is called an experimental group, that's the one being manipulated, and a control group, that's the one that's not being manipulated. And the idea is in a true experiment to randomly assign people to either group. So if you have an experiment with 100 people, 50 people will be assigned to the experimental group by chance, and the other people not by chance. If it is not that way, it would possibly be called a quasi-experimental group, which often happens with existing groups. Like for example, in school, if you're trying to do research with classes, that would be quasi-experimental because people select the classes based on their work and other time constraints. And so if you're doing experiments in the classroom, that's typically quasi-experimental and not as good as true experiment. In experimental research, you're relying on statistics. Remember the two types of statistics, descriptive and inferential. So you're using inferential statistics. And the idea is to control the extraneous variables so you can actually tell where there's a relationship between the two variables. Next slide. And it's very important to understand the concept of validity and reliability. Validity is the idea that if you make a claim that X leads to Y, is it true? So if it's always true within our research study, that's called internal validity. And if that's true outside of our artificial research study, that's called external validity. And the idea is that no study in the world can maximize both. So you're trying to figure out how to do a study that's going to tell whether the association between the two variables really is what you're claiming at the end. Next slide. So I said this already. I compared the true experiment and the quasi-experiment. So true experiment is the best type. Pre-experiment is where you have no control. So you just do an intervention where you're trying to see if something has an impact, but you don't have a control group for comparison. When you have no control group, the researcher or research team will have some problems making any generalizations as to whether the intervention, the independent variable, actually impacted the dependent variable. It could actually be by chance. Next slide. So a correlational study is a study where you're not manipulating the dependent variable to see, the independent variable to see the impacts. You're just basically seeing if what's happening in the real world or in the research study, if there's any link or an association between the two variables or two or more variables. And with correlations are between +1 and -1. 0 correlation means there is literally no statistical association. And you can, if you do a correlation study correctly, you will find out based on one empirical study whether there seems to be a relationship between the variables. Next slide. I think we're already out of time now. Anyway, the purpose of correlation studies is to explain human behavior. You can actually have correlation studies outside of human behavior. So it's just if there's relationships and it's predicted likely outcomes. However, because it's not an experiential study, the prediction is not going to be definitive. When you do a correlation study, you're going to be able to get a prediction equation depending on what the items are, but there yi equal a plus bx1. Next slide, and then you can plot a scatter plot. Next slide. I think next slide should have that. It doesn't even have that. At any rate, so like it's going to ask questions like, is X related to Y? Does P predict C? And basically it depends on what those variables are in your relationship. In general, for experimental studies and correlation studies, you want to have a sample that is at least 30. And you always want to choose an appropriate population. And then in a correlation study, you're going to be using the correlation, whether it is Pearson's or Spearman-Rowe, in order to do it. And then the P is to interpret the correlation coefficient properly. So if you go to the next slide, hopefully you will see that it varies either positive or negative. So this is a very simple thing. You can go and read up about it. But if the numbers are close to 1, it's a very strong relationship. And then minus 0.9 is a very strong negative or inverse relationship, which means as one goes up, one variable goes up, the other one goes down. If it's a positive relationship, one goes up, the other one goes up. And if it's low, so like plus 0.25 means that there's a weak relationship between X and Y. If it's minus 8, can somebody tell me what kind of relationship that would be between A and B? If the correlation between A and B is 0.8, what kind of relationship is that? Is minus 0.8. Don't all speak at once. If the correlation between A and B is minus 0.8, what is the nature of the relationship? Based on the table.
Negative, miss.
But it's more than negative.
Inverse relationship.
Relationship.
But I wanted to say inverse moderate relationship. Looking at the screen. You want to talk about both the magnitude and the direction. So it's a moderate inverse relationship. Anyway, it is 6 o'clock. And I think you can enjoy the rest of your day. Actually, I have another class. So this, I stop sharing the YouTube channel. This is actually on YouTube. So hopefully you can just search for my name because this is actually on YouTube. Let me try to. Oh, it's not, it stopped. Oh my word, it's not on YouTube anymore. Because I got, I can say this is very tricky. Because I got disconnected, the second half of the thing stopped streaming. Wow. No, it's still streaming. I thought it was stopped.